bring in Haiyan here. Haiyan, do you agree with that, and what more needs to be done?
I agree partially, and I also see a lot of challenges. I do think that the gender equality is one of the biggest achievements and legacy of Chairman Mao's letting women holding up half of the sky. If you look at the basic well-being of women in terms of their literacy rate, in terms of their longevity, in terms of their overall well-being, yes, there has been a big achievement. However, I see several gaps. One is really in the gender income gap. If you look at the annual income of male versus female, the earning powers between female and male, there is still a 30 to 40% gap for similar jobs.
Like here in the United States?
Yes. And then women tend to get lower paying jobs. That's the first gap. Second gap is really the wealth gap. Not only in terms of the annual income earnings, but you look at the assets accumulated under the house heads tend to be men versus the female, there is a huge gap. Majority, I would say 3/4 of the assets, the wealth, are accumulated under the male's head. And third, you do have a power gap. You look at the power in terms of corporate top executives. Women are only less than 10% of the very senior level of the executives in corporations. And it may be a little bit better in private firms, but a very little percentage at the very top in terms of the state-owned enterprises, public offices, etc. And the final gap, and then the political gap, of course, in terms of the highest echelons of political powers, whether you look at the percentage in Politburo, percentage in Central Committee members, and they represent less than 5%. And finally, I do see there is a mentality gap. There is the traditional values of, women, it's better for women to marry well than doing well. And that traditional value is very hard to erode.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I want to go women's rights being at the forefront of the Chinese Communist Party since 1949, yes. And Chinese policy. They have changed this one-child policy to two. Is that going to make a big difference for women?
I think that not in terms of national policy, as President Xi said, that women's equality issue is not just a human rights issue, but also, it's also inclusive, sustainable development. It's very, very important. It has always been the national policy. However, in reality, because of that traditional value of favoring boys over girls, I could see that girls' power in the family could reduce a little. For example, if a family has only one girl, that one girl is going to be the princess. If a rural family can only afford one kid to go to college, and that is that one girl. But suppose you have a girl and a boy, many families may still prefer boys. And also, two childs adds to the responsibilities to women, and that could reduce women's ability to fully participate in jobs, in climbing the career ladder. And that actually in the long term may set up a role model for the girls to see their mother to be more of a housewife-driven woman than a full career woman.
That's a very interesting point. Let's expand this out to the rest of the world. How does women's place in China changing place compared to, say, the United States? You spent a long time here, and also other rapidly developing countries, for example, like India.
I think that China has done a significant, great job, in particularly as you compare to other developing countries. And I think that the economic development, really the rising waters lift up all boats in terms of creating well-being, creating wealth, creating job employment. On all of the dimensions, if you compare China versus India, China is far better off. Women's longevity is at least 10 years older. Women's literacy rate is at least 20% higher. In terms of adolescents' fertility rate, India's adolescents' fertility rate is 4 times that of China. That is not good for girls. And when you give birth that early, below 19 years old, and when you look at the percentage of entrepreneurs in China, 1/4 of all entrepreneurs are actually female entrepreneurs. That is one of the highest. So, education. Not just in primary education, in college education, half of the college students are female. Half of master degrees are female students. Even PhD students, nearly half, 48% of the PhD students are female. So when you look at all of these progress, you really have to give credit to the Chinese Communist Party's push to the economic reform. as you compare in terms of gender gaps with the Western countries, gender income gap in China is still bigger than as compared to, say, OECD countries. Wealth gap in China, particularly in rural China, is still significantly bigger than, say, in a rich economy like in the US.
But you have that wealth gap within China, which is dramatic as well. But your point is extremely well taken up, because we have 3 women bosses, and we love working with them. So it was a really interesting fact to see. Haiyan, are women getting to those management positions? You touched on it before, and political power also.
I think that it really, if you look at it across the board, private entrepreneurs, private companies, small, medium, and medium-sized enterprises, all the way to the large state-owned enterprises, the pictures vary. I would say that there are more opportunities for women to start their own businesses. In fact, half of the internet-based companies are started by women.
That's fascinating.
Smaller businesses tend to be owned by female, but as the size of the companies grow larger, particularly in the manufacturing sectors, particularly in the state-owned sectors, you see the percentage of women on the top started to dwindle a lot more. And the hope is, as China shifts more towards a service-based economy, as service sector pick up a higher percentage of the economy, that women would have a lot more senior management positions or ownership positions. One of the in terms of the very effective ways of giving women more power in corporate is, for example, in European countries, like in France, you will have law that specifically require a certain percentage of boardmanships to be owned to be occupied by female. Some of those legal requirements tends to be very effective right away. And sometimes it takes a long time for traditional values to change, for the business practices to change. However, those legal requirements could help. And another factor, and I think that in terms of hiring women, is that you need to have the legal path for women to file lawsuits if there is a discrimination against women, whether it's in the hiring process or in a promotional process. I think that if women begin to see that that legal path is there for them to pursue, and that would, I think, that deter some of the employers from pursuing the discrimination practices.
That's fascinating discussion. We're going to have to leave it there, though. Haiyan Wang here in the studio. Thank you so much.